It started as one of those peaceful afternoons where all I wanted was to unwind. The sun was shining, a soft breeze was rolling off the lake, and I decided to fly a kite like I used to as a kid. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet moment on my own ranch by the lake. But apparently, that was enough to trigger full-blown drama with the HOA. I wasn't even near their property, just standing near my dock, enjoying the open sky. That's when I saw two of them, HOA board members, marching toward me with that. Looked like I'd committed a felony. Next thing I know, they're on the phone calling the cops. At first, I honestly thought it was a joke. I mean, who calls the police over a kite? But the situation escalated fast. Within minutes, a deputy pulled up, clearly annoyed but doing his job. The HOA insisted I was invading their space, disrupting community tranquility, whatever that means. But here's where things take a twist. They didn't realize that the dock they were defending so aggressively, it's not even on their land, it's on mine. You see, I bought this ranch years ago and had the land surveyed thoroughly. The lake itself is shared, but the shoreline on this side, including their fancy dock, all on my property. I never said anything before because I'm not one for drama, but getting the cops involved over a kite, that pushed me too far. So I calmly pulled out my documents, ready to show the deputy exactly where the property lines were. And that's when the entire situation shifted. You could see the color drain from their faces. But just when I thought that would settle things, one of them muttered something under their breath, and that's where it really started getting out of hand. The deputy raised an eyebrow, clearly picking up on the tension. I stayed quiet. But I caught at one of the HOA board members muttered something like, "We should have just fenced it off when we had the chance." That stuck with me. Fenced it off. From my land. The nerve! I didn't say anything right away. I just handed the deputy the property map from my file, the one that clearly outlined the boundary lines. As he studied it, the board members kept shifting around, trying to peek over his shoulder, trying to control the conversation like they always do at their meetings. Only this time, they weren't in charge. You could feel the shift in the air. The deputy asked a few sharp questions, and suddenly they weren't as loud anymore. But instead of backing off, they started talking in circles, claiming there was some historic usage agreement that gave them access to the dock and shoreline. I'd never heard of that before. No paperwork, no permission. Nothing in the deed. Just bold assumptions. I knew the HOA had been pushing boundaries lately, telling folks what color to paint their barns, trying to regulate the height of garden fences, even threatening fines over flagpoles. But this was different. This was them trying to claim part of my ranch. And all of it kicked off because I dared to fly a kite. The more I thought about it, the more things didn't sit right. Why were they so desperate to control that dock? Why did they panic when the deputies started asking about property lines? There was something more going on, something they didn't want uncovered. And I had a feeling this kite incident was just the tip of the iceberg. What they didn't know was I wasn't about to let it slide this time. Asterisk, asterisk, later that evening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole situation was off. I went back through my file surveys, deeds, even old ranch photos my grandfather took when he first bought the land. Everything backed up what I already knew. That dock was planted right on my side. Still, I couldn't help wondering why were they so dead set on keeping it under their control. What was really going on? The next morning, I took a walk around the lake's edge just to clear my head. That's when I noticed something odd. Near the dock, behind some bushes, there were fresh tire tracks like someone had been hauling something. In or out. I followed them around a bend where I hadn't been in weeks and found a locked storage box. It wasn't mine, and I definitely hadn't given anyone permission to install it there. The HOA never asked. It was just there. That added a whole new layer to the mess. I talked to my neighbor Carl, who's lived around here even longer than I have. When I mentioned the dock and the tire tracks, he just raised his eyebrows. Turns out, the HOA had been quietly extending their reach for years. Carl said he'd been pressured to sign something about shared amenities, but he refused. Others caved. Most didn't even understand what they were signing. It started to make sense slow, quiet land creep. Nothing official, just subtle intimidation and misleading paperwork. Meanwhile, I kept getting emails from the HOA demanding I cease. Disruptive activity on the shoreline, including flying kites, grilling, even fishing. Fishing on my own land. They were doubling down, maybe thinking I'd fold like the others. But I wasn't about to. I needed to find out what else they were hiding. Because the deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about control. And I was starting to suspect that dock was covering more than just planks and nails. A few days later, I decided to quietly check out the dock early in the morning, before anyone from the HOA was out. The fog was thick on the lake, and the whole place felt strangely quiet, like the air was holding its breath. I brought my phone just in case, mostly for photos, but part of me already knew I might find something I wasn't supposed to. I walked along the shoreline, staying out of sight behind the trees until I got close enough to get a better look underneath the dock. That's when I saw it hidden beneath the planks. There was a small power box and some kind of wiring running back into the trees. It didn't look like normal dock lighting. This looked like equipment someone had rigged up quietly, and not recently either. I snapped a few pictures, then froze when I heard voices. 2 men were approaching, talking low but fast. I ducked down behind the rocks, heart pounding. One of the voices belonged to Greg, the HOA president. The other one I didn't recognize. They were arguing about the setup, saying something about how it had to stay quiet until the paperwork came through. I couldn't hear it all, but it was clear they knew this wasn't legit. And it sounded like whatever they were hiding had nothing to do with community benefit. It was about keeping something secret. Something they'd installed without permission, on land they didn't own. I stayed still until they walked off, but now I had questions they didn't want me asking. Why was the HOA wiring up equipment under a dock on my land? What were they powering out there, and why were they so afraid of people finding out? By the time I got back to the house, I knew I needed help. Not just to prove the land was mine, but to uncover what exactly the HOA had been doing right under everyone's nose. Whatever it was, it went beyond kite drama or dock access. And it felt like I was getting close to something they'd do just about anything to keep buried that night. I sat on my porch going over the photos I took, zooming in on every wire, every marking, trying to make sense of what the HOA was hiding under that dock. That's when I noticed a small label on one of the power boxes. It had a company name I didn't recognize. I looked it up, and that's when the second twist hit me. The company wasn't a utilities provider or anything local. It specialized in surveillance systems, not community cameras. Long-range equipment used mostly for private security, or something more questionable. Now it was clear this wasn't just about power lines or shoreline control. They'd been running some kind of surveillance, set up from under that dock, and they'd been using my land to do it. Without permission, without disclosure. And worse, possibly without even informing the rest of the HOA members. The ones paying dues likely had no clue. That's when it hit me. They weren't just guarding access to a dock. They were guarding information. I made a few quiet calls to neighbors I trusted. Most were shocked when I told them what I found. But one, a retired contractor named Earl, went silent when I mentioned the company name. Then he told me something that made my stomach turn. A few months ago, he'd done a small repair job at the HOA office, and he'd seen files marked with homeowner names and coordinates. He didn't think much of it at the time, but now, paired with what I found, it started to feel like more than just overreach. It felt like monitoring. The mood shifted quickly in the neighborhood. People started whispering. A few residents who used to be pro-HOA suddenly stopped showing up to meetings. Someone even took their approved member sign down from their yard. It felt like something bigger was brewing, something that had been building quietly behind the scenes, and now it was starting to unravel. And I was right in the middle of it, holding proof that could expose everything. I knew I couldn't let this slide anymore. The next HOA meeting was in 3 days, and I decided that was where everything would come to light. I spent the weekend gathering everything: property records, survey maps, photos of the dock setup, and screenshots of the surveillance company's services. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning, not even Earl or Carl. I wanted it all to hit at once, no warning. No chance for them to cover it up. When the meeting started, Greg and the rest of the board looked smug as always, acting like everything was normal. But when it came time for open discussion, I stepped up. I calmly laid out my documents on the table, one after another, and walked everyone through the timeline from the day they called the cops on me for flying a kite, to the discovery under the dock, to the company tied to surveillance tech. At first, the room was dead silent. Then, people started murmuring. Greg tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. I asked the board directly, why was there private surveillance equipment under a community dock installed on land they didn't even own? And why had no one in the HOA been informed? That's when the twist hit. One of the board members, a woman named Marcy, stood up. She looked pale but determined and said she'd warned Greg months ago that they needed homeowner approval for any security setup. Apparently, he'd gone ahead anyway, bypassing a vote, using HOA funds without disclosure. Everything unraveled fast after that. Members demanded audits. Greg tried to deflect, but the pressure was too much. He left the meeting early, and by the end of the week, he had resigned. But just when I thought it was over, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a flash drive. On it, it's footage from the dock, camera time-stamped and zoomed in of me weeks earlier. Before any of this started, watching, recording, someone had been keeping tabs long before I ever touched a kite. And now I had to figure out why. I handed the flash drive over to the local sheriff's office. They reviewed the footage and confirmed what I already knew: someone had been watching me well before the kite incident. But the real surprise came. When they traced the equipment purchase, it wasn't made by the HOA. It was bought by Greg personally. Turns out, he'd been using HOA resources to install private surveillance across several shared spaces, not just the dock. And the reason? He was in a quiet legal battle over a separate property dispute and was trying to gather leverage on other homeowners who opposed him. The sheriff launched an investigation, and while no criminal charges were filed due to lack of direct harm, the exposure of everything led to massive changes. The HOA board was dissolved and restructured. Several members, including Marcy, stepped up to rebuild trust and enforce transparency. New rules were passed to prevent any future misuse of HOA funds or private surveillance on shared or private property. The dock was removed, and I, officially, reclaimed my shoreline free of hidden cameras, wires, or uninvited drama. As for me, I went back to flying my kite by the lake. The breeze still felt the same, but now there was a peace to it. No one lurking, no one watching, just the sky, the wind, and my own land. Looking back, that simple act, flying a kitten, covered a lot more than I expected. It reminded me why it's important to know your rights, stay aware, and speak up when something feels off. Sometimes the biggest problems start with the smallest things. And in a world where even a kite can cause conflict, standing your ground can make all the difference.